joining me right now is Ms. Nathalie Tocci. She's the former EU foreign policy advisor, continues to watch foreign policy very, very closely where Europe is concerned. And today, the way we've seen NATO allies, a lot of European nations come out with their reactions. How do you read those developments, Ms. Tocci, especially the reactions coming in from NATO allies like Spain, United Kingdom, Norway and Denmark and Spain have taken a stand against the United States of America, the others gingerly supporting America?
Well, I would say that the mainstream European reaction revolving around France, Germany, the UK has basically been one of almost, I'm not quite sure how to define it, almost dystopic. So if you were an alien and you landed in Europe on Saturday morning and you read the declarations of some of these leaders, there is no way that you could have actually figured out that the United States and Israel had attacked Iran. So in a sense, there was, yes, correctly so, a condemnation of the Iranian regime and its treatment of its people, a condemnation of Iranian counterattacks on countries in the Gulf. But there was no reference whatsoever to what had actually triggered all this. It's as if Iran had woken up one morning and decided to kind of send missiles left, right, and center. So that, I would say, was the core of the European reaction. Then, indeed, as you were suggesting, there have been some outliers. And Spain, on the one hand, as well as Norway and Denmark, would probably be the three that have been most outspoken in terms of actually calling a spade when it comes to this war. But obviously, this is not, in a sense, where the core of Europe lies. And then there have been other countries still that have been even more explicit in their backing of the US and Israeli attacks, countries like my own, Italy, for example. So on one level, I would say, well, you always tend to have different European reactions to whatever happens in the world. But I would say, broadly speaking, and from a very personal standpoint, very unfortunately, this has been a reaction which has actually sided really implicitly or explicitly, rather sort of significantly, with a major violation of international law.
The sheer fact, Ms. Tocci, that there was apprehensions, a lot of unease, especially during the trade talk and the trade wars which went on, where EU and European nations were concerned, and now this. Do you see it makes certain countries very uncomfortable and possibly look at a new kind of order? Or do you see most of them backing the United States of America?
Well, no, so let me put it in these terms. I think the reason why there is an instinct to back the US on this front is probably twofold. And it has obviously very little, if nothing at all, to do with international law, because, as I said, we're talking about a completely illegal military attack on a sovereign country that did not at that point in time pose an imminent threat. I think this needs to be highlighted. So why is it that Europeans have tilted, as I said, with all the due differences, but have tilted towards the US? I would say two sets of reasons. One is that Europeans increasingly, or a core of European countries increasingly, looks at the world through the lens of the Ukraine war. And of course, as we know, Russia and Iran have had increasingly strong, especially military relations. And so Iran, from being viewed as, quote unquote, only a question related to regional security as opposed to non-proliferation, as opposed to even human rights, became viewed through the lens of Ukraine, right? And that in and of itself tilted the European view on Iran in a very negative way. On top of this, there is indeed that transatlantic connection in which, as we know, the United States under Donald Trump has also sided very much with Russia on the war in Ukraine and has threatened countries like Denmark with the annexation of Greenland. And so, in a sense, here we are, Europeans, how can I put it, trying to keep the US on side by not confronting the US on something like Iran, where deep down, because of what I just said about the Iran-Russia connection, they in any case are against the Iranian regime at all. So if you like, a rather, that core European position has, I think, in many respects been rather cynical, I would say, certainly not very values driven at all. And I think probably the most evident articulation of this has been when German Chancellor Friedrich Merz really rather explicitly said, you know, international law is not actually the most useful frame to understand this conflict. Well, if not international law, then may I ask, then what?
All right, but Ms. Tocci, do you see the stance change of many countries? Because there are, and they are going to be, economic implications, and things will only get worse.
Yeah, I think that may well be the case, although it probably, I mean, I think as the consequences of the war worsen, you may paradoxically first see an even stronger support for the US and Israel, and only later that may turn into something quite different. Of course, the parallel that I have in mind here is the 2003 war in Iraq. You know, there are many critics of that war that are critics today, but actually back then were not critics at all in Europe. So I think, you know, as the consequences worsen and as it becomes over time increasingly obvious that this war of choice was a terribly bad idea, then you may see European reactions changing, but in a sense it will be at a time in which it's too late.
Okay. All right, appreciate you joining us, Mr. Tocci. Thank you there. We're going to leave it at that. All eyes on all developments that are taking place at the back of the crisis that continues to unfold in West Asia.